folks who want to say hi to a few folks who have just joined. And yeah, let's get started. All right, so let me blow up this screen here. And if at any point there's any problems with the screen sharing, just let me know. So welcome to this evening's UBI policy discussion group. I want to begin with acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that I'm hosting this evening's discussion group from the lands of the Barramadigal people in the Parramatta area of New South Wales. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all calling in on today. Basic Income Australia pays our respects to elders past and present. So before I jump into the agenda, I just decided to take this time to put one of my favorite basic income images or memes. So yeah, human reasons to work. I can say for myself that I really think about this a lot when I think about basic income. All right, so I'd like to run through the rough agenda for this evening. So I'll start with some introductions. I'll go through some introductions about Basic Income Australia, our speakers tonight, and some definitions and the objective for tonight's discussion group. Then we will start with Abigail. So open the floor to her, and there'll be about up to 20 minutes for Abigail to share the Universal Wellbeing Payment Policy. Then we will change gears and then move over to Michael Haines of Basic Income Australia, and he'll spend about 20 minutes sharing the alternative policy out there right now. Then we will have about 5 to 10 minutes. I'll just leave the floor open first for Abigail and Michael to ask each other any questions. And then from then on, we will have the floor open for the whole group for audience question time. And so I think for this evening, please collect your questions as you go. We really do hope to have a really robust and dynamic conversation tonight, both face-to-face and in the chat. And then I'll close out in the last 5 minutes. So hopefully that sounds good for folks. Okay, so about Basic Income Australia. We are a diverse community of professionals and activists across Australia, committed to spreading awareness, education, and the implementation of a universal basic income. So there are many different definitions of the universal basic income. It is a bit of a dynamic space, but I elected to take this definition for this evening. So a basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. And this definition is taken from the Basic Income Earth Network, which we can think of as a type of global peak body that represents basic income advocacy and research. So with great pleasure, I am introducing our speakers tonight. So Abigail Boyd, New South Wales Greens MP representing the Central Coast. She is the author of the Universal Wellbeing Payment, and she has background in psychology, law, and global banking regulation. And then I'm also pleased to introduce Michael Haines. He is one of the directors at Basic Income Australia. He's the author of the Basic Income Australia policy, and his background is in executive leadership across a wide range of industries, including 16 years with Toyota Australia. So just see something in the chat. Okay, beautiful. So let's see. And just to round off my introduction for this evening is the objective tonight for our discussion group. So I was really piqued when I first learned about universal wellbeing, the Universal Wellbeing Payment at the Basic Income Congress last year, where I met Abigail. And yeah, so for me, it was really, it was the first major basic income platform put forward in Australian politics in recent decades. And both the UWP and the Basic Income Australia policies propose approximately $615 per week UBI tied to the Henderson poverty line, albeit with distinct approaches to funding and implementation. I can share the resources later tonight, but that inspired me to write a comparison blog to, it's really interesting when we start to get two policies out there in the space, because we can start to compare and contrast and think even more deeply and then more concretely about, how could these policies work, pros and cons. And so, yeah, that's has led to our discussion group tonight. And so we've invited Abigail back for another discussion group. She was last here a couple of years ago, and had a chat with us. So yeah, I've invited her back alongside Michael this time. And hoping to deep dive a little bit further and present, compare and contrast the main design elements of their UBI proposals. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And Abigail, the floor is over to you if you'd like to share anything.
Absolutely. Hello. Thank you so much for having me here. As I said at the when we were chatting before, this is actually quite a nice respite from the election campaign. I am a Greens MP. I'm in the New South Wales Upper House, which means that I represent the whole state for the Greens, but I do live on the Central Coast, and I would like to acknowledge that I am also here on stolen land on the Central Coast, which are the lands of the Awabakal, the Darkinjung and Guringai peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This land is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. I do like to say to people when I'm talking about progressive economics, often I get these questions about, basically from people that think that there's only one type of economic system and only one way of doing things. And I do like to reflect on the fact that, Aboriginal people lived in this country for tens of thousands of years in a sustainable economy. And I feel like that maybe helps people to focus a little bit more on what we could do differently, and the fact that this is actually a system designed by people that can be changed by people. So we are in the middle of an election campaign. I just wanted to talk very briefly about kind of what I guess drives my desire for a UBI and for progressive economics overall, because I think that sort of guides why we have the UWP the way it is. I've been traveling around the state, and everywhere I go, I'm seeing really bad things. So I'm seeing, a neighborhood center that is giving over 500 breakfasts every week to children who otherwise wouldn't be fed, getting no government resources. We're seeing, essential workers across the state not being paid what they should be paid and being under-resourced, public schools being under-resourced. And I've been reflecting on this in the last little while, because I feel like it feels like we're sort of in this rotting stage of our economy where everything's gone a bit wrong. And we've forgotten how to look after people. So I think we look at the last, especially 50 years of neoliberal thought, really permeating every aspect of our lives. And I think that it's led to us seeing ourselves not in relationship to each other anymore, certainly not in relationship to nature or to the land. And I think that this neoliberal thought has also interrupted our sense of selves and our relationship with ourselves. Which means we have a mammoth task when it comes to rebuilding and repairing our society. And I honestly believe that we start with a UBI. So I believe that is the basis of reconnecting us and beginning to understand again that an economy, if you were designing an economy from scratch, you would always ensure that everybody had a basic level of means to live, and not just to survive, but to thrive, before anyone else can take the surplus. And that's not a radical concept. And whenever I say things like that, I get called, a communist, or that's the politest of the words that they use. But I think what we're talking about here is the basis of any economic system. Even if you're an absolute mega capitalist who believes that we're all individual productive units, if you want the most productive units, you have to have the happiest and healthiest productive units. So even if you looked at it from that perspective, it makes sense to build people back up. So the economic system at the moment is sort of eating itself. And I've got like an 8-year plan because I'm in Parliament for 8 years for this term. And I have this, what we call in our office, the progressive economics mega plan, which is every year having a new sort of idea that we're trying to get not just our own members in the Greens to understand, but then to be able to talk more broadly about that. It was during the first lockdown in 2020 that my team and I decided we were going to spend just, a couple of months developing the universal basic income proposal that we've called the universal wellbeing payment. And we decided to do that detailed work for 2 reasons. The first was because I think that universal basic income, it really is understood. I think Owen was saying this before. It's really understood as being something quite different depending on which version of it you've encountered. And there are, of course, some really conservative versions of the UBI out there, particularly what are we now, like 50 years ago in the 60s and 70s in the US. I've probably got those decades wrong, but a long time ago with very conservative versions of UBIs, which actually, or of basic incomes, which were more about replacing government services than supplementing them. So we wanted to make it very, very crystal clear what we were talking about. And so that's why we decided to do this much more detailed proposal. But also because we thought that by putting it together in a detailed way, we would allow people to really understand how their lives would change if we were to implement a UBI. And when you look at this on our website for the UWP, we go into, we've got sort of a detailed Q&A, and we have sections that are like, what if I'm a person with disability? What if I'm on a pension? What if so that people can look and say, okay, this is how it might change my life. So that's why we did it. And I think since then we got the Greens in New South Wales to embrace it and then to push for it at a national level. We then got our Australian Greens policy updated to explicitly recognise UBI as a thing that we want. So yeah, it's been useful already. Turning to why we did what we did with the UWP, and we were very careful and argued for a long time about the language as well. So it is universal in that it applies to everybody over 16, and that point was chosen for quite a few reasons as well, but also, this 16 is the age that you can leave home, you can decide not to be at school anymore. 16 is cognitively when your hot and cold cognition is at a relatively developed state, at least similar to what you would see, at least cold cognition, to what you would see in adults, and also because it just, for lots of reasons, 16 to us seemed like a very good age to start this. And to deny 16 and 17-year-olds, we think would lead to us not giving that autonomy and that freedom at a time when so many, particularly disadvantaged children who are in domestic family violence families, situations, etc. If we left them hanging for 2 years, that it wouldn't give us the results we wanted to see. So basically all residents and anybody who's in the Centrelink system or would otherwise be eligible to be in the Centrelink system. And again, this was built on the idea that you only see the real benefits of a UBI if you apply it at that whole of society level. We don't want people who are here on, temporary visas or something, having some really shitty standard of life, but just for a technicality, because they're not a resident, or because people aren't citizens. We don't think that's fair. This is about having a society that as a whole benefits from UBI, not based on your particular luck of being a citizen or even just a resident, really. So you'll need to have a bank account. That's kind of one of the criteria, and I will put in a plug for stage 2 of our economics mega plan, which is our public bank of New South Wales, which provides free deposit accounts to every single person in New South Wales and whoever else wants one. So we spent a long time, and I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are on this, because I feel like it's not as commonly thought about, but we spent a lot of time arguing amongst ourselves and also with other Greens colleagues about whether or not prisoners should receive the UWP. Does it get suspended? Do you lose that entitlement like you lose so many other entitlements when you go to prison? We decided that the UWP should still be paid to prisoners, but not necessarily directly into their accounts while they're in prison. And I think where we ended up, so on the basis that there are so many people in prison who are there because they they lack resources, or they've been they're in difficult times, or they've grown up in families, for whatever the reasons are that they've not been supported. There's a huge number of people in prison who are there for non-violent offences, and if we want to stop reoffending, it is better to provide people with a stability of financial resources. So if you're, again, a 16-year-old who's been put in prison for some sort of petty theft, maybe stole a car or something, if you are able to come out and be able to instantly have that money to be able to get yourself accommodation, to buy yourself a uniform or something, to try and get a job, obviously your chances of properly being rehabilitated and not reoffending are going to be much higher. There will, of course, be circumstances where there are people who are going to be in prison for a very long time. And in those cases, or in violent cases, or really kind of, I guess, much more serious cases, our view was that we would leave it to the judge to say, well, actually, this UWP amount should be paid to the victim's family, or should be paid to, maybe it needs to be paid to the prisoner's family in order for the children of that prisoner, for instance, to still be able to live where they live. So we thought that there were so many different circumstances in which what would be fair in those circumstances, that would be the way to deal with that. But I know from reading a lot of the literature on basic income that's not everybody's view, and I'm very curious to hear what people on this call think of that. So in our view, for it to be universal, there needs to be no conditions and no means testing. So that results in everybody getting paid. Even if you're a billionaire, you will get paid this amount, but you would be effectively taxed back. So if you are a billionaire, you're going to pay it all back in tax. There's no circumstances in which you'd be able to dodge that. So we did think a lot about maybe it should be wealth tested. Maybe there's some other ways that we should be trying to restrict this. But because that whole of system approach is, in my view, the thing that results in I guess, that universal aspect, and not having to go to Centrelink and not having to sort of prove your circumstances, is one of the aspects of UBI that creates such benefits for mental health, for removing the stigma around, being a welfare recipient, and also removes the need for the bureaucracy, which of course saves you money. We came to that conclusion that it would be better to just continuously pay that amount than to introduce some sort of conditionality. And one of the arguments that I found quite persuasive also was, for example, people fleeing domestic violence, who on paper would look quite wealthy, but actually don't have any financial autonomy, having the UBI being paid into their account. And we've one of our suggestions that it has to be every single person has an account. You don't, your partner's money is not paid into your account. The whole point is to have that autonomy. Then to us, it made sense for it to be paid to everybody, and then to be taxed back over time. And we've got on the website, we've got a very detailed way of how we collect that back, depending on where you are in terms of the median wage. So if you're over, I can't remember, sorry, but I'll have to have a look on the website. I think it's maybe 150% of the median wage, then you're paying everything back. And then it sort of tapers down from there, so that it's progressive. So then the word well-being instead of basic, because we don't want this to be seen as basic. We want it to be seen as a lot more than that. As I said at the beginning, it's an amount not just to survive. It's not like welfare. You just get this little amount because then you're supposed to be punished or somehow inspired to, not sit on the couch and instead to go and get a job. We know that's rubbish. We know that when people are paid well, or paid a sufficient amount, they don't sit around for long. That's quite rare. So I think that idea of it being about well-being is an important part of how we capture people's imagination with it, but it's also it's a prime part of the philosophy behind it and what we're trying to achieve. And that idea of every single person should have this minimum level of well-being before others take the surplus. So it's not an amount that still forces you to take on paid work, because you may not be in a circumstance where you can do that. You may be doing volunteer work or caring work or an artist or whatever. And it recognises the right of all of us have a minimum, have a right to a minimum standard of well-being, completely distinct from our right to find meaningful work. The connection between income and work needs to be broken in sort of, the way that we think about things. And so finally, the UWP is a payment. It's not income. It's not something you have to do something for. It is an amount that you're owed for being a participant in our society to spend however you like. And it's paid in addition to any other additional needs that you may have. So people with a disability, parents, carers, other groups continue to receive more in recognition of their additional expenses. That's an additional amount in a different part of the system, because again, we want that UWP to stay completely unconditional and unmonitored by the state. So we have built into the UWP a design to ensure that governments aren't let off the hook for providing essential public services like education, health, public transport, etc. And the way we've done that is by the rate of payment being independently reviewed and adjusted depending on cost of living pressures. So if the cost of essential services increases because governments are backing out of their obligations to provide them, then governments will have to pay more in a UWP. Again, I'd be interested in hearing your view on this, because there is that danger then it begins to become seen as a voucher system. Somehow, oh, it's fine, you're getting UWP, we'll just pay you more and then we don't need to provide our public services. I just don't think that this can operate in a vacuum. Like, obviously, we also need to end privatisation of essential public services and have universal housing and everything else. This is not the only thing we campaign for, but that needs to be sort of carefully monitored. But that is the idea of it. Finally, I hope, I'm looking at the time, the universal wellbeing payment would ideally be implemented nationwide. And I'll come clean with you. The reason that it's a state proposal is because I'm a state MP. And so that's my remit. But also I do believe that as a basic principle, and I get really cranky when the feds and the state constantly argue about whose responsibility certain things are, like schools and hospitals. If, ultimately they're both completely responsible from a moral and ethical perspective. And if you're in a position in your state where you could implement a UWP by doing an agreement with the federal government to adjust the Centrelink amount and to get a credit back basically for the amount they would otherwise be paying in Centrelink payments, then I think you have an obligation to try and do that. And so I think it is, you know, as I say, it's not ideal, but there is absolutely a way that you could implement it at a state level if you wanted to. And we've had interest from other Greens MPs around the country to do something similar. It's almost like a trial. I don't like the idea of a trial. I think we've done enough trials, and I don't think that, I personally, I think that if you to actually get the proper benefits of it, you need to see it at a whole of system level, which means, you know, the rich to the poor, the rural to the cities, everybody needs to get it so we can properly look at it. But if we want to call it a trial for federal purposes, then so be it. So I think I am just about done. Yeah, I'm just checking my notes. I had nothing else I think that I need to touch on. So thank you again for having me and allowing me to talk about UBI, which is one of my favorite topics.
Oh, thank you so much, Abigail. That was brilliant. So I had penciled down a few notes for us to circle back to after we have Michael present. But yeah, no, I just want to say thank you so much for just a candid, you know, sharing of your thoughts on that. Okay, so I will now open the floor to Michael. And yeah, over to you, Michael.
Okay, well, thank you. And Abigail, that was really engaging. My talk is going to be much more formal. I've got a slideshow to present. So, but thank you. And I really don't think we've actually got much to disagree about. There's a couple of things I'd like to talk to you after my talk. But if I could share my screen now, I'm just going to bring it up. So can everybody see this? Can everybody see my?
Yeah, we see.
Yep. Okay. So we'll just. Okay. So I want to just give you a brief overview of the talk. We've already had a definition, and I'll just say what our objective is, and also why we see the UBI is needed, and it's to fix a fundamental flaw in our system. I also want to show how it creates a 4-tier income system, and just briefly cover the research that we had looked at to expose the major concerns, which are basically inflation, labour market impacts and behavioural impacts, and then show how our proposal addresses those concerns and summarise some of the benefits at the end. So first of all, the objective is pretty simple. It's to introduce a UBI paid to all adult Australian residents every week, and happy for the Greens to broaden that. If we can get it broader, that would be fantastic, at or above the Henderson poverty line by 2030. And the current target that we've costed was $500 a week, but as Abigail has said, it's more like 600 or so now with recent inflation. But we're suggesting that we start with a low initial payment, and I'll come back in the talk to explain why we suggest that. First of all, why UBI? And we see that it's a system problem because once upon a time, everybody could live off the land. But since we've invented property rights, money, and the system of paid work, it's no longer possible. And as Scott Santons has observed, humans are now the only species that need money to survive. And we recognise that the system has delivered huge benefits for the majority, but it's left a significant minority literally destitute. It's the people who can't do paid work and who've got no savings or family support. And that's about 3.2 million Australians, 12 to 14% of the population. It's mostly women, kids, the aged and disabled, and some between jobs. And economic growth can't solve this because providing more jobs doesn't solve the problem for people who can't do paid work at a particular time. So this changes throughout life. There's not a constant group of the same people there. The group is always changing. And so the people are poor, not because they're lazy, but because they can't for a time earn money. And without money, they're invisible to the market, so the market can't respond to their needs, which is obviously bad for them, but it's also bad for business and ultimately bad for society. And yet we've got unlimited money simply because we create the stuff. And in Australia, we have the capability to meet everyone's basic needs and in fact, much more. Welfare is not the answer. We see that it's part of the problem because it must be deliberately set below the poverty line to encourage people who can work to take the available jobs. And we can't fix it by paying more because it's rational for people to take the benefit in lieu of a low-paid job. And that's the welfare trap. So a UBI provides a system solution to this system failure. First of all, it restores each person's birthright by providing the money that they need in a modern economy to survive. And secondly, it avoids the welfare trap because people don't lose their UBI if they take on paid work. It actually provides a floor to stand on. It's not a ceiling to achievement. So we then end up with a 4-tier income system. At the base, the basic income for everybody's basic needs. There's earned income for the 50% of the population able to do paid work at any time. Additional welfare costs to meet the cost of living for incapacity or child or aged care. And for the fortunate, a passive income if you've got your own savings or family support. So how will it work? Well, in order to design it, we did research over about 18 months and we've ended up with a 115-page policy paper, which if you care to read is a link to the website. But in looking at over 30 pilots across 40 years and the recent Swiss referendum, it was evident that all of the pilots showed at least some positives and really no major negatives. And yet despite that, politicians, economists and much of the media raised concerns that if you do this across the whole population instead of just a target group in a target area, what are the impacts on inflation? What are the impacts on the labour market? What are the impacts on behaviour? There's a great deal of uncertainty in people's minds. And even though many support it, there is the fear too that it's too costly and we can't afford it. So in designing our version of the UBI, we've particularly looked at how we address these concerns. And first of all, we're suggesting that the idea of a UBI should be separated out from normal government. So just like we have a reserve bank that's got its own charter, this would be a new authority with its own charter. It would liaise with the Reserve Bank, Tax Office and Welfare, and I'll explain why in a moment. But it would have the obligation to set and manage the UBI. And it would do it similar to how the Reserve Bank manages interest rates in small steps. And so what we see is that we can do a phased introduction based on a universal scheme, but phasing it to mitigate risk. So we're suggesting starting as small as $10 a week, but once the scheme is in, you know that $10 is the minimum that's now going to come in every week for life. And for a person in poverty, that's food for a day. So even from day one, it's going to make a difference to some people's lives. But then increase the rate at $25 a quarter over 5 years to reach the current target adjusted for inflation. Now, as I say, these numbers will have to be increased, but the principle is the same. Now, by phasing it in this way, what it allows us to do is, first of all, establish and attest all the administration systems, because we're going to have to capture all of the homeless people and everybody else. We're going to have to make sure that nobody's double dipping and that the systems work smoothly. We're going to give the supply chain time to adapt without creating shortages that drive inflation. So if you suddenly had a huge influx of money that changes the demand patterns, we're going to end up with the sorts of disruptions we've seen with the pandemic and the Ukraine war. By taking it slowly, we can avoid all that. And it means that rather than people seeing an inflation spike and blaming it on the UBI, we understand that it's just the dislocation of the supply chain. And therefore, we give the supply chain time to adapt. And importantly, there are many people who are already in government and in private organisations, charities, who are geared to support people in the current system working for Centrelink. They are going to have to move into different roles, shifting from compliance to support. They're going to have their own jobs changed or even removed. So there's a lot of adjustment there, which can be done if we phase it in slowly. And finally, a phase-in allows us to deal with the uncertainties without having to rely on models, because we can simply look at what is happening in the economy, monitoring inflation, the labour market and behavioural changes. And if we see that there are adverse impacts, we can then halt the increase in the UBI to countermeasure them, or as we are hoping, more likely, as we see the benefits far outweigh the negatives, we can speed up implementation. So the other thing that we're doing is looking at targeting. Now, how can you pay it to everybody and yet target? And the way we're doing it is that we're suggesting that we pay it to everybody, just as Abigail says, into a bank account every single week. You'll get your $500 or whatever dollars a week. But up to $80,600, which is about $1,550 a week, there would be a phased-in recovery where you would have to pay back a portion of your UBI, and above 80 grand, you'd pay it all back. And this would be done through the tax system. So effectively, it is, as Abigail says, a progressive tax, but it's done in a way that separates out the UBI from the normal tax system. So we can say we're not touching tax, we're actually giving you money and taking some of it back. We also would be replacing welfare benefits below the UBI, but if your benefits that you're currently on exceed it, then you would still get the excess over and above it. And we believe this combined process will benefit about 75% of the population, and the rest will benefit from additional activity or living in a less fearful and hostile society. So they will have no negative economic impacts, the 25%, but they'll be better off because society will be better. Now, just to explain what we mean by this payment and recovery, if you're earning 52 grand a year, that's $1,000 a week, and you'll pay your normal tax, giving you 838. Every week, in addition, you will get $500 going into your bank account, but because you're earning, you'll pay some of that back. In this example, 322, giving you a net 178. So if you add that to your net income after tax, you're actually getting in your pocket more than you're currently getting at a gross. So you're clearly better off. On the welfare side, the job seeker benefit, the UBI would fully offset it. So you get no job seeker benefit, but now you're getting UBI in your bank every week, unconditional. And clearly you are better off financially. And you'll also then have more time because you're not having to jump through the Centrelink hoops to study or look for work or to care for yourself and your family. So the reason for paying it universally but targeting the net is, first of all, it reduces the amount required to fund the UBI while benefiting those who need it most. And then offsetting the UBI against welfare means that no person can be worse off. And then as the UBI is raised above the benefit, they'll obviously be better off. And paying it and recovering it might seem inefficient, but what it does, first of all, is it makes the payment universal. So there's no stigma for receiving it. There's minimal administration. You turn 18, or if we go with the Greens, you turn 16, you get it, and for the rest of your life, that's it. And there will still need to be an audit, but it'll be based on your taxable income, just as normally now taxable incomes are subject to audit. And that's the same for everybody, so there's no stigma. And by paying it, recovering it, it provides basic income insurance. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you lose your income for any reason, and that could be you get divorced, your husband or wife has got the money and you've got nothing, or you're sick or injured, or your business fails, or there's a natural disaster, floods, fires, droughts, economic or political impacts such as the Ukraine war, or for any other reason on the screen, or for any other reason at all, you are assured that your UBI is coming in every week to meet your basic needs. And if you lose your income, there's nothing therefore to recover. You get that money to spend that week. There's no delay, no need to apply. There's no bureaucracy to prove that you qualify. And that gives you more time to look for work if you need to, or care for yourself and your family. So I want to place this in the broader economy by looking at the bathtub economy, and it's taking Scott Santon's analogy. If we imagine the bathtub is our whole economy and it's full to the brim, the money's there in the tub, circulating as people buy and sell, it's running at full capacity. Now, the question is, most people probably don't understand how money gets into this bathtub, and it's got a few taps. And one of those, one of the major ones, is the banks. The banks create money as they make loans. Now, you might not understand that, but the simplest way to understand is to think if you loan money to somebody else, you haven't got that to spend. They've got it to spend. But if you give it to the bank, you can still spend your money. It's your deposit. But the bank manages to make loans, and they do that by simply writing the amounts into their books. And I can explain more if anybody's interested, but take it on faith at the moment that when the banks write loans, they are pouring money into the economy. And the government also pours money through spending. Now, obviously, if you've got a full bathtub and you're pouring money in every day and every week, then it's very quickly going to overflow, which means that you've essentially got huge inflation. So as money goes in, it needs to come out. And the way it comes out in the banking system is that people who have had loans start repaying, and those repayments go to the bank and they are written back into the thin air from which they come. So it's drawing money out of the economy. On the government side, tax is levied, and that too draws money out of the economy. Now, if there is a problem in the balance, as we're seeing right now, the interest rates that banks charge can be increased through the Reserve Bank's policy levers, and that reduces the flow of money into the economy and therefore can help maintain the level. Or the government can run a deficit in times when there's a need to stimulate the economy, or a surplus, again, drawing money out. So a surplus is when they take more tax out than they're spending, and that too can depress the economy. So now I want to just shade government, because ideally over the long term, what the government spends, they ought to be taking out in tax in reasonable balance, because that allows us as citizens to agree to the level of taxation given the sorts of policies the government is implementing. And so if they're basically in balance and we've got the monies coming in from the banks, we're now looking at the UBI as another tap. We've seen that there will be some recoveries out, but there will be a net stimulatory impact. So what we can do in the very first instance is use the increase in interest rates to turn down the bank tap to offset the inflow from the UBI money. And what that means is we end up with the economy still running at full capacity, but now more is being, more activities going to satisfying the basics, and there's less on other spending. So just in a little more detail, we can do all this without changing the tax rates, increasing debt, taking from other programs, or increasing inflation. So this table covers in a bit more detail the flow. So for 20 million adults at $500 a week, that's $520 billion a year, which is over 25% of Australia's $2 trillion economy. Now that is simply unsustainable, but we've seen the offsets already. Recovery based on earned income will give us back about $213 billion. Welfare and admin savings that I spoke about, another 142. In addition, as the money goes in, it'll circulate and create new profits, which will be taxed as normal, and that tax can also be used to offset the inflows. As well, those profits and higher salary earnings get taken out of the real economy and go into the financial and international economies, and that'll save us about another 30 billion. Technological deflation has been ongoing for a long time, well over 1%, and that can, once we get over this current inflation hump, will continue, and it will offset some of the inflationary impact of the UBI, and there will be savings from improved health and lower crime and increased productivity of another 20 billion we're sort of estimating. And that will leave a residual net amount of about 50 billion, which is about 2.5% of the whole economy, which could simply fund growth. So we can see on these numbers at least, a UBI can be paid to everybody with recoveries that will not be inflationary, no changes in tax, no changes in debt. However, inflation might still be a problem. We might reach a time where interest rates can't be upped anymore without really damaging the housing market and other parts of the economy. And so what we're suggesting there is that a new flat tax could be levied. It wouldn't go to the government, it would go to offset the UBI as another drain out of the economy. And when you combine that flat tax with a UBI, you get a distribution curve as shown by the blue line. So on the left there is the net tax rate, and on the bottom is income from low to medium to high. And above the red line, you can see there are positive tax rates. So the more you earn, the more net tax that you will pay after your UBI. But below the line, the negative rates are showing a net benefit for those on zero or low pay. So the whole system is progressive, even though everyone's paying the same percentage tax and receiving the same UBI. It means then that we've got a UBI that will stimulate activity. We can reduce the bank tap by increasing interest rates, or as a last resort, increase the drains by levying a new flat tax. And in doing that, we will, as we said, move to more and more basic and less on other spending. One of the other things that can happen is once we reach the poverty line, we can then use the UBI as a powerful tool to balance the labour market. And that's because everyone has a different desire and ability to take paid work depending on their stage in life. And so as the UBI is increased, some people will choose to stop looking for or will drop out of paid work. They'll say, I've got enough to live on now, and they'll reduce their hours. And that will leave an opening for somebody who still wants the work. It means that the job market then will cycle through a new dynamic balance. And most vacancies will be filled in standard recruitment times, and most people who are not in paid work, as well as those in paid work, will be doing it by choice. So we then have a new set of levers. We can now increase the UBI to balance the labour market. We've still got the increase in interest rates to turn down the bank tap, and we've still got the option to levy a flat tax on spending to ensure that the economy is running at full capacity, but more for basics and less on other spending. We then end up with three ways to inject new money into the economy. A basic income to meet citizens' needs as their birthright, fixing the system failure, government deficit spending for additional public goods and services that we agree, and bank lending for borrowers' needs. But if you look at these of the three ways, given people have to have money to survive, then clearly providing a UBI for survival has to take precedence. And one last thing it can do, it can also act as an inflation circuit breaker. As we gradually increase the UBI, it provides an effective wage rise without cost to employers. So right now, there's the concern that with inflation, that there could be a wage push. Those wage increases get fed into the cost base of employers who then look to increase prices, and you get this terrible wage price spiral. It's not happening at the moment, but that's the fear. But with the UBI, there is no cost to employers. People get a wage rise to help meet the cost of living, but it won't feed into cost push inflation. And it has the other benefit that a wage rise doesn't, in that it benefits people who are not in a job. And it could be a big win for unions and employers, similar to the 83 Hawke-Keating Accord, if they get behind this. We recognise, however, it's not a silver bullet. It addresses only the demand side. We still need government to ensure the supply of adequate housing, health and education. We need NGOs We need to provide the life skills and the tools and support to help people thrive and not just survive. And we need unions to better share productivity, shorter work week, mutual flexibility, and so on. A UBI could be transformative. We've identified 59 benefits for individuals, business, the economy, government, and the community. And we've looked at the theories, the modelling, and the piloting, and they've all shown the possibilities of universality, which eliminates systemic poverty, effective wage rise for low pay, some compensation for unpaid work in the home, a basic income insurance for the rest, and a new tool to help balance the labour market, less anger and fear in the community, more productive effort and entrepreneurship, less crime and better health and education. That's the theory, but the only way to prove it is to do it, starting small to minimise risk. Okay, that's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Okay, so to kick us off now, moving into discussion time, I do want to open the floor first to Abigail and Michael. Just first of all, any questions to each other to start us off?
Could I just make a comment? As I said before, I think, Abigail, is in terms of principle and direction, I agree with basically everything that you have said. The issue around prisoners is something that we also looked at, and one of the issues that we considered was that while you're in prison, then the state is providing your accommodation and your food and your clothing and all of that, so that there's much less of a need while you're in prison, but that when you come out, there ought to be some money that's been put aside to give you a fresh start, so enable you to pay the bond and to buy clothes and everything. And then from then on week, you will have the UBI paid from the day you leave fully. But I think what you said about maybe that money going to the family of prisoners or victims, I mean, that is something that is worth considering. But yeah, that was pretty well my only observation in where.
And so on that, we also talked about that idea that, maybe it goes to the costs of the prison, but then it became, and I guess maybe being in politics in New South Wales with such a conservative bunch of people who have been in power, and knowing their obsession with privatising everything. If you had this income stream, this ready amount for every prisoner coming straight in, they were already privatising prisons. It would just incentivize them to privatise them even more.
It wasn't meant that it should be paid towards, it wouldn't be given to the prison supplier. It would simply be reduced so that the amount of money going in to pay the prisoner would be reduced to a smaller amount while they're in prison. But yeah, definitely not paid.
No, and I understood your point. It was just more that, yes, you then have to think about where that goes next in the minds of evil people. So just good to see it happening. But yes. Could I ask you, Michael? So you've looked a lot at the inflation issue. I'm curious about just how much of an issue that is, because it seems to me that inflation is only ever raised as a fear when we propose giving money to poor people. But whenever we talk about tax cuts to the really rich and giving them lots of extra money, apparently that's not a big deal. Like it's 230 billion or something for the stage 3 tax cuts. Apparently that's not going to have an impact on inflation. And yet if we were to give pretty much the same amount in a universal basic income, then that's seen to be inflationary. I just think maybe that fear is blown out of proportion.
Yeah, I think the thing that needs to be, I guess, the bathtub analogy is a good one, Abigail, because there are some other drains that I didn't show in my picture, and those drains are into the financial economy. So the wealthy drain money out. So money flows up to the wealthy much faster than it trickles down. But once it's flown out of the real economy into the financial economy, because it doesn't trickle back, it's actually like another drain drawing money out. So if you give a tax cuts to the super wealthy, they're not going to be spending it on, food and housing and the sorts of things that the people who receive it in the universal basic income. So it will have a different inflation impact, and certainly a gross amount of what was $500 a week, that's 25% of GDP. So however you look at that, if we just poured that in from day one, it absolutely would be inflationary. And so that's why we've really said, and it's what you're suggesting in the way tax is structured, we've separated it out because when you try and touch the tax system, there's so many people who've got a finger in the pie, it becomes very difficult and it becomes another argument. And so we basically said, and that's why we separated out on that pay slip, right? Here is your income and here is your tax. And we're not touching that. We're actually giving you an extra amount of money, but we'll take some of it back depending on what you earn, right? So you can never be worse off because the most we will take back of you is the $500, right? But you will always be better off. And if you're earning no money, you'll be getting the full amount. So the net effect is the same as what you are basically proposing through the tax system. But psychologically, we're saying, we're not touching the tax system. We're giving you a new amount of money, and yeah, we're taking some of it back. And the reason why we're doing that is to make sure that the net amount isn't inflationary and that it is targeted to the people who need it, but do it on a week-by-week basis. So if I'm earning $1,550 a week this week, and I therefore have to pay, I get my UBI in and I pay it all back, and it can be done automatically through the group tax system or the GST system or through a specially designed app for self-employed people. It all just happens automatically. But next week, I haven't got any leave, sick leave, and I've got to look after a sick kid, or I lose my job, or for any other reason, I suddenly find next week I haven't got any income. Well, there's no repayment. I don't have to apply. I don't have to, anything.
And that's the same. I think we're on the same page on that.
Exactly the same. It's more about the concept of how it's presented, rather than substantial difference. And so
I think we might need to agree to disagree on the inflation point.
Yeah, okay.
I think I really disagree in terms of this is actually, once you tax it back, the actual increase in the amount of money that will be going into the economy to people who currently, can't eat and can't find houses and all the rest of it. Given what we're seeing at the moment with inflation being driven by profit gouging, it's broken all of those old rules about inflation. Like what we're seeing now is no longer the kind of the drivers that you would have seen for inflation even 20 years ago. So the idea again that there would be this much greater inflation through actually giving people the ability to pay for basic goods and services. I don't think it's backed up by any of the trials either. Like they tend to talk about how the luxury goods went up rather than it being, and maybe the answer is just that we tax richer people more on wealth in order to level that out.
I just say there, Abigail, think about it. When you're taxing rich people, if what you'll end up doing is collecting money largely in the financial economy. And that money is not at the moment feeding back into the real economy. It's in the trading of stocks and bonds and other financial assets, and in also potentially the trading of property. So not building new property, but trading property. And that money if it's collected out of that asset base and pumped into the real economy, it's just like printing new money. It's because it's going from people who are not spending it in the real economy and giving it to people who are. And that's why we're looking at saying, let's focus on ensuring that the money is going to the people who need it in a way that we've got some other levers, like in the bank lending side, we can tweak to ensure that if inflation does arise, we understand the levers that we've got. So again, that's why we're also saying starting small, because we don't know for sure, right? And nobody knows for sure what the impact's going to be. But if we start small, we can, monitor what's happening and just make sure that we're doing it in a staged way. And yeah.
So I think, I will have to stop talking so someone else can ask a question, but I'd love to speak to you at another time about the financial markets, because that's my bread and butter. That was my previous career. So I view it differently, but yes, for another time.
Right.
I'll shush now.
No, so it's good to see now we're seeing some, different approaches and a different understanding. Before I just open the floor, and I see Owen's hand up as well, but just for this dedicated question time, is there anything else that Michael and Abigail you wanted to raise before I open the floor fully?
I guess just one more thing, and that's, I understand the staged input and the staged implementation. I think from a political perspective and from a marketing it and selling it to people to make them excited, I have a strong belief that we need to be putting out big, bold ideas in order to get people's imagination triggered, for them to have the vision, for them to want to go on to something like this. And I think if it got presented in a more incremental way, I think we would lose some of that willingness to do it in the first place. So I think that your way of doing it is obviously better from a kind of, this is how you do it from an economics perspective, to test it and all the rest of it. But I think from a making it happen perspective, we kind of chose that let's do it for the whole state and let's commit to do it for at least, 5 years and see what the results are. But yeah.
All right, thank you. So I do see the first hand up, so Owen, over to you.
Oh yeah, thanks. Abigail, on that point of making it interesting, I do agree it has to be interesting, although Michael, the idea of making it incremental, I really like the notion of it's not going to get out of control. But anyway, on the point of making it interesting, I was writing an article recently, actually. I called it The Virtues of Being a Dole Bludger, and I was making the case for UBI. And also I mentioned that if people knew that they could quit a job that was immoral or just pointless, then they would. And that, maybe that would see a faster transition away from fossil fuels, for instance. If these people thought, my job's killing the planet, should I just quit and get UBI instead? Is this too far-fetched, do you think, you guys? And as well, are there any similar comparisons that you think could happen?
Abigail, I'm happy to comment, or you?
I'm going to be very honest and say that I didn't hear the question. I'm really sorry. Could you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
I'm so sorry.
I was saying, Abigail, that if someone has a job that's immoral or pointless, they might quit. They might quit their job more readily under UBI, and so we might see like a faster transition away from fossil fuels if all these people say, "My job's immoral. I'll quit and I'll get UBI instead."
I think that's a really interesting question now that I've heard it. I'm distracted, sorry, because it's election campaigning. I've got two
fair enough.
up here and it's all just nightmare. So I think this is really interesting, because one of the arguments that I often hear to a UBI is that if we give people a UBI, who will clean the toilets?
That too, yeah.
And I always think, well, if you have to keep people in poverty in order to find people to clean the toilets, then you're doing it all wrong. That's not how the economy should work. Clearly, those people need to be valued more. And so if their wages go up, then that's a good thing. And I think similarly, like a lot of those, undesirable jobs, it's a, like, I don't know about fossil fuels, because I think it depends on whether the people in those jobs, some of them certainly don't want to be there, but some of them quite enjoy the high salary they get anyway, and see that as compensation against the fact they're doing something they don't really want to do. A bit like when I was a banker. So I can relate. But I think, and again, Michael, you were talking about like the impact on wages, and we don't want to sort of, I guess, maybe spook employers, but I see this as an opportunity to actually rebalance. If we can't exploit people to do the jobs we want them to do anymore, and we have to actually pay them properly, then that resets the whole system. So again, I think that's why I'm a bit more sort of, I see the economy at the moment as being so fundamentally broken and so in the way of us achieving any of the things we want to achieve in terms of tackling cost of living crisis, even COVID, which is still ongoing, or the climate crisis. We've got this thing that's urgently in the way, and we need to change that economy quite rapidly. So I guess my mindset comes from that very, let's make a disruption, and let's revalue jobs. Let's get rid of the bullshit jobs that get really well paid, and let's start paying essential workers like cleaners and others something that makes them want to work.
All right.
I agree with that.
Thank you. I see a few hands up, so I'm going to start with Howard.
Hi. I've got a bit of background in economics, mainly university, but also, I understand about the public dialogue about economics. And certainly Michael's taken the conventional type of economic analysis, which I think you have to do. You have to have it as an analysis, but you don't actually have to accept it as being necessarily valid, because conventional economics is a mixture of a kind of science and ideology, like things like the trickle-down effect, multiplier effect, the natural acceleration inflation rate of unemployment. There's a hell of a lot of ideology in there, and it's not very nice ideology. You don't have to accept it, and I think the discussion tonight has actually indicated that, like, I'm on side with Abigail. Like, when you're talking to an audience, you're not necessarily going to be talking to conventional economists. So I think your conclusion was really good. Your conclusion was, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know what effect it's going to have on inflation, on jobs. But we have some, as Abigail has pointed out, we have some evidence about it. Now, as we move forward, the actual challenge is going to be to convince the electorate to take it on, and to counter the propaganda that's going to be thrown at it. And even if you implement it and it does start working, you'll have problems, and those problems are going to be magnified by the people in power who don't want it. And that's what everyone's got to be prepared for. So what we need is a variety of approaches, and patience and persistence. There's just no substitute for it. It's the same with everything. Like, I've been involved with climate emergency for 30 years. One of the most proven scientific theories, and we're still arguing about it and about how to do it. But we're persisting. And UBI is also very important, and we've got to persist as well. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, could I, thanks for that, Howard. Could I just say that you're right in that, we know with the climate change, there's incredible science, huge support, and yet we still struggle to actually make the necessary changes. And so that's part of the reason why, again, we've looked at starting small, is to, quell those concerns, and that in the end, that the people who potentially, or not potentially, the people who are in power, who you may think could be against a UBI, could ultimately see that it's actually in their interests, because as you said, Howard, the trickle down is debunked, but money flows up really quite quickly from the poor people who spend it through the businesses to the rich. And so this UBI is going to be pumped in at the bottom and very quickly flow up to the people who are already wealthy. And we shouldn't say, well, that's terrible. It's going to happen. But if in the process we're ensuring that everybody is in fact getting their basic needs met, and potentially keeping the labour market in balance, then we shouldn't begrudge it happening. We should encourage it and therefore encourage the wealthy to get behind it because it's going to literally benefit them. And so my feeling is that they will fairly quickly come around to the idea once they see the real results in practice.
Thanks, Michael. Over to Emma.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to a couple of points that people have been making sort of regarding inflation and quitting jobs and that sort of, and global warming and all of these things. I think that there's not enough acknowledgement of the potential deflationary effects of a basic income. So like, for example, people might quit their jobs because they've got a really long commute. That would reduce pressure on gasoline, as well as that might for a time reduce their spending if they're getting less money, and they would take a longer time to maybe find a job that's closer to them that they might like more, and having more financial security might choose to pick a job that gives them greater meaning. A lot of the pilots show a lot of deflationary behavior, such as paying off loans, going back and studying instead of working, looking after children, for example, and taking on more caring roles. All of these sorts of behaviors have deflationary effects. So I think to some degree, like what Howard was saying about some of these like myths in terms of our economics, I think that maybe like we have to do a UBI to find out, but I think like maybe the inflationary bogeyman is a myth also. That's just my point.
I really like that. Can I just hop in on 2 points? I think one thing that I get frustrated about is people worry about us breaking this economy, that, you know, if we do something too quick, it might have this effect or it might have that effect. We don't need to intervene for the economy to keep breaking. Like, it's broken at the moment with inflation being caused by corporate profit gouging. That no one did that on purpose. And so, you know, I say that, but it was a result of government policy over a period of, you know, many decades. But the point is that we don't get upset, you know, and sort of concerned about the already broken system. But when we then propose something that might be better, people say, oh, you know, we don't really want to do that. I do get the point that people, you know, in terms of convincing people, it's really important, obviously, that we get a majority on board, but we only need a majority. And ultimately, the people in politics pay attention to what the voters tell them. And so when we have an increasingly small percentage of people who consider themselves wealthy, when you look at, you know, the sort of people who used to be considered relatively well off, now doing it tough as well, and more people are in a system that doesn't work for them, we're getting more and more people being open to change. And so I don't think we need to worry about the super wealthy. We're only worried about them at the moment because they have such a disproportionate impact on our democracy, but they don't need to. So I think if we get people engaged in the ideas, that's how we convince policymakers to give something a go.
Thank you, Abigail. Sandra?
So I've got 2 questions. So it's really interesting to actually see this platform here and see, you know, on the one hand, we've got incrementalism, and then Abigail, you're just saying, let's just go all in. And I think everyone that's here that's curious about UBI is actually quite impatient, and we all do want something to really shift. So I just wanted to say that. But Abigail, you know, you were talking about pilots. We understand the limits of pilots, essentially what you're doing is a massive pilot. It's a state pilot. But my question is, do you see any value in, more smaller pockets of community in New South Wales getting around this issue of basic income and actually experimenting? Do you see any value? Because that's something I'm interested in.
Yeah, I'm super interested in that as well. I've been thinking about that recently in terms of, how a local council area could do it. And I think they'd have to do it in combination with the local currency in order to really be able to work out the impacts of it. And to be honest, I haven't got to the point of being able to sit down and work out how I think that might work. But I think, yeah, I like the idea of local economies anyway, because I think from an environmental perspective, they tend to be better. From a community bonding perspective, they're a good idea. But if we could bring a UBI into that sort of local, I think it'd be great. But yeah, I have not worked out the details in any significant form. So if anyone else has, I'd be really interested to hear about it.
I just had a second question. So I have been absolutely captivated by what's happening with robo debt, and so just so crushing. And I've come from the sector of working with vulnerable communities, so the system is broken. My question is, do you feel, we already know there's so much support for the idea of a universal basic income, just based on some of the polls that have been happening before COVID and after COVID. But do you feel like what the Royal Commission is uncovering, do you think that's also going to fire people up and think of another narrative? Because people can see how punitive it's been and cruel and inhumane.
I really hope so, because so many people suffered so badly. People took their lives, and I think if there can be one good thing coming out of it, it's an understanding of just how inhumane and cruel the system is. And I think one of the reasons why I'm keen to do a much sort of broader, more immediate type of UBI is because we get rid of Centrelink almost entirely. And I think you take the opportunity to get rid of it entirely, because I think it's a bit rotten from the core, from a cultural perspective as well. If you can replace that with assistance for those people who have additional needs in a different context, I'd also get rid of the NDIS the way it's been implemented as well, because it's gone the same way. It should never have been seen as welfare, but it's been seen in, it's kind of suffering from the same type of cultural rot that's led from the top with that kind of, you will only get everything that you can possibly prove and nothing more. It's this real meanness. I think that with that stuff and with the fact that people were able to get a form of UBI during the first parts of COVID, I think people are beginning to really begin to think about whether we are doing these things the right way. So I think, maybe politically, that's the way you do it. You say, let's scrap Centrelink, let's have a whole new system. The bureaucracy, the costs of the bureaucracy, both to people's lives and also from a financial perspective, can be avoided. If we have this UBI, like maybe it all comes together. But yeah, Stephen's just said he's not seen any mention of UBI in the robo-debt reporting, nor have I. But I'm hoping that people kind of begin to draw those connections, I guess.
Thank you.
Could I just pick up on what you said, Sandra? I certainly think that there's an opportunity that as we are promoting the UBI, for local communities to get together to say, if and when this money comes, how potentially can we use the inflow to not only benefit ourselves individually, but through pooling or refocusing resources to use some of the money to say, buy sustainable energy and whatever, that conversation can happen well ahead of the actual inflow of money, so that when the money comes in, everybody's not floundering around, what are we going to do now? It's well thought out beforehand. So, yeah, I absolutely support what you're trying to do, as you know.
Thank you, Michael. I put a hand up for myself as I also have some questions. So I'm really curious, Abigail, coming off the back of what you mentioned about, yes, COVID was such an equalizing experience, or a relatively equalizing experience across many societies. And yeah, there was just such a, it was such a boon for UBI supporters, because it became like a natural experiment. And when we increased support payments just across all Australians, and a lot of Australians felt that understood more the challenges. Yeah, and that was in 2020. There's a lot of discussion about how do we take advantage of this movement? How do we not waste a good crisis, I guess is another way to put it. So just wanted to get your update or thoughts on, like, how are we going in terms of UBI in the political discourse? Yeah, and how have your efforts been going, and what's the word amongst Parliament?
So slowly but surely is, I think, the answer. So Australian politics is always influenced by what goes on in other parts of the world, and I do find it fascinating. If I get up and say a thing and I get laughed at, which often happens, like when I talk about a public bank, for instance, and then I point out, well, actually, they have these in whatever countries, I get a very different reaction. And I think seeing the uptake, or at least the uptake in interest across other parts of the world, as well as just more people talking about it. We had the South Korean delegation come to Sydney recently, and they were talking about it, very interested to talk more. And I think, yeah, there's definitely, I think overall there's a definite shift in the population in terms of their acceptance of progressive economics as an idea. I think our politicians tend to be more economically conservative than the rest of the population. So, because it doesn't, it's I guess compromises their major donors, and they're when you're serving the big end of town, anything that's going to shake their dominance is problematic. But yeah, I sense a definite change after COVID, of people who found themselves for the first time in trouble, realizing that, oh gosh, like those people I used to think were bludgers, actually, no, this can happen to any of us. And I think having that larger sort of proportion of people experience that has helped. But yeah, I think there is a more of a acceptance of general progressive economics, but also you begin to see it coming through even in the Labor Party. It's not accepted policy yet, but people are proposing it at their conferences. So I think it's, yeah, slowly but surely.
No, that's really encouraging to hear. Thank you. So I'm going to do one more question, which is Stephen, and then, just conscious of time, I'm just going to do closing remarks, and then bid us good night. So yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, so I've always been wondering what sector of society is going to pick up UBI and run with it. I've been waiting for unemployed people to run with it. I've been waiting for artists to run with it, but it's just not happening. So, like, where do you see it kind of erupting, like when it does? Because I think that has to happen, doesn't it? Like, the support has to mobilize somewhere. So where do you see that coming from?
I think it comes from two places. I think it comes from civil society, from social services. Was it Anglican or Anglicare?
Anglicare, yeah.
That recently, So I think that's kind of the beginning. But I also think I'm not a religious person, but I do see some significant alignment between certain church or certain religious moralities and that sort of progressive economics. And I think we've seen some churches and religious groups come out saying, yeah, we ought to feed and clothe everybody before other people can take an excess. So I think maybe the church groups we might begin to see something from. So yeah, that's my pick, social services, because they see the impact every day on people, and they know that's not people's fault, and you know, they don't buy into that stigma. And then church-going folk, I think.
My understanding, Abigail, is that ACOS is still not supportive of a UBI, that there's a couple of people there who really are sold on a job guarantee, which I just find incomprehensible. But so I'm pleased that you get that feel that there is a change. It does seem that we've still got a fairly significant struggle ahead of us to sway the majority of decision makers, and somehow we've got to be able to get to that group of people to see that it genuinely, you know, it's in their interests. But anyway, hopefully discussions like this, and we can help broaden it. So I want to thank you personally for coming along and giving us all the opportunity to hear the vision from the Green side, and feel that we're all heading on the same road. It might be parallel, but it's still the same road. So thank you.
No, well, sorry, Jessica, you want to you do that. I will wait until you've spoken.
Oh no, this is great. The last thing, apart from just the resources on the screen, which I'll leave up for people, is in the last 30 seconds, just from each of you, what's the call to action? What can we do from tonight? Maybe starting with Michael.
Oh, thank you for springing that one. I think we just have to use every means possible now to get the communication out. We've got our own communication group, as you know, focused on what is the message and where do we start promoting it. And I mean, Abigail and what the Greens are doing, the more voices that are out there. We've got, I think, at the end of the year, the seminar that Dario is working on, which he's hoping will get a few thousand artists to come along to, taking Stephen's point that that could be a great media event if we can work it with them to, again, promote awareness. So yeah, anything we can.
Yeah, call to action, other than signing up to our UWP website, so that we can spam you with all information on how we're going on that. I reckon there's no substitute for face-to-face conversations with people. It's slow, but the more people we talk to, the more people they talk to. So I reckon a good call to action is, by the end of the month, go and speak to 3 people that you've not spoken to about UBI before. And see if you can maybe get them interested in the concept. And I've written myself a call to action for myself on my list of things to do after the election, and that is speak to the unions about UBI again, because this fetishization of work and this threat that it gets expressed around, you want to do away with jobs. I don't think it's quite rational. I think you can have both a jobs guarantee and a UBI. And so I've written here to try and have another crack at the unions. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I wasn't lying when I said that this is the respite from a really horrible campaign. So it's really nice to be able to talk with you all. And I think, my role in the UBI movement is comparatively easy. I just get to sort of mouth off about it, but I couldn't do any of that without the good work of people like you, Michael, doing the actual, the hard slog, and everyone else that works in this. So thank you. And together we will get there.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you. Let's end it there. But to both Michael and Abigail, I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed this evening. And yeah, I'm really glad we get to have this conversation and move this forward. So with that, we'll call it a night. Thank you. We'll stop the recording now.